It's 1982, and the birthday party are playing in New York, home to bands they've admired since they first learned about music. But the guitarist Mick Harvey can't even stand up straight. He was throwing up vodka and only managed to get on the stage because the other guitarist strapped his guitar on and pushed him out there. The singer, in his tight gold pants, wraps the mic cord around a girl in the audience, which gets him punched while his golden pants split in a very unfortunate place, and the drunk guitarist starts berating the audience through the microphone. 10 minutes after they start, the plug is pulled, and the club promoter forces them off stage. Just like that, the birthday party managed to sabotage another fantastic opportunity and ruin their dreams of blowing New York away. But that seems to be just what they do. They were a band with a truly unique sound, full of revolutionary musicians who just couldn't stop themselves from burning it all to the ground. This is the story of the birthday party. If you want to join me as I learn more about music history, consider subscribing. It's free to do. You can always unsubscribe anytime you want if you're no longer feeling it. Also, if you want a bigger impact on the kind of topics I cover here, the bands I cover, the genres I cover, if you become a member, I'll take those suggestions a little bit more seriously. And if you're a longtime viewer, I take those suggestions more seriously too. So if you want to, you can become a member to make a more direct, positive impact on what I'm doing here. The link is in the description below.
It's a wild world, a wild world.
Nicholas Cave was born in a small country town in Victoria, Australia in 1957. His father, who was an English teacher, maybe wasn't the most nurturing, but Nick remembers a specific moment when he was 9 years old and his father read the opening paragraph of Lolita to him. He said it was the most intimate moment he ever spent with his father and helped inspire that passion for creativity in him. Nick said that he enjoyed the landscape and the nature of his hometown, but he hated the attitude of the small town rural community. As a 9-year-old, he joined the local choir and said there was a hierarchy in the choir that was based on your robe color. You started in black and then progressed, ending at purple. But he said, quote, "I remained getting taller and taller in a black cassock at the end of the line, which had something to do with the fact I couldn't sing solos." He remembered watching the Johnny Cash show with his parents, and that had a profound effect on him. He said it was the first time that he realized music could be uncomfortable and kind of dark. It didn't have to be happy pop music all the time. It could be used for something different. His mother was a violin player and into drama, so she encouraged him in his earliest musical and creative pursuits, like signing up for piano lessons and choir practice. Then his brother introduced him to some progressive rock coming out of England, and that's what really made an impression on him. He said, "As a teenager, I was a big English progressive rock fan. Pink Floyd, Jethro Tull, Procol Harum, yes, Emerson, Lake and Palmer. I loved that stuff. I still do." Eventually, his attitude issues led to him getting into some trouble as like a 12-year-old, and his parents thought the best course of action would be to send him to a boarding school where he could have a little bit more oversight and authority in his life, I guess. So they sent him to Melbourne. But at that school, he was kind of an outcast right away. He didn't like sports. He was more of a theater kid, more on the drama and art side of things. So that ostracized him immediately. But he found a close group of friends who also were more on that artsy side. He quickly bonded with them, became very close with them, and some of them even have a band. So he joined that. In 1976, he enrolled in a technical college to study painting, thinking that that's all he ever really wanted to do with his life. But he was still in that band with his school friends as well. He said that art was the only thing he actually applied himself to study at school, where he was known for being pretty mischievous and rebellious. He said the band was something he did on the side, not as his ultimate dream. And one member of that band, Mick Harvey, would become a longtime collaborator with Nick Cave. Mick was born in 1958 in Rochester. His father was a vicar in the Church of England, so they moved to the suburbs of Melbourne when his father was placed at a church. Mick, of course, as you would imagine, with his father having the job he did, also joined that church's choir. When he enrolled at this boarding school, he quickly met Nick since they were the ones routinely getting picked on by the other boys. As Nick remembered, "We were interested in art and we weren't particularly interested in sport, so we were considered homosexuals. There's no two ways about it. We were the school." Mick said he was immediately interested in Nick because he always stood out. He was someone who everyone could tell didn't care about authority. That was fascinating to Mick. Mick was already in a band with several people, so they invited Nick in. From the very start, they enjoyed mixing up styles and not fitting in with any kind of thing. Mick said, "We wanted to break the shackles of normal formulae. So our use of 20th century American genres like rockabilly and blues was often quite tongue-in-cheek. It wasn't that we disliked those sources, but simply that we used them as absurd points of departure." The drummer of their group, Phil Calvert, was born in Melbourne in 1958, and he started playing drums when he was around 4 years old. He was a super huge fan of rock music. He worked in record stores and he loved reading rock star biographies. He just always had a sense of wanting to be in rock music. He said that in school, he very quickly gravitated towards Mick and Nick and their other art school friends because they were interested in the same kind of things. And he mentioned that at that point in his life, he was super interested in the counterculture, the kind of like hippie movement. He said that he truly believed in it and he thought that they were on the precipice of launching a better future, doing things differently, figuring things out, making things right. And he said it's a little bit disheartening to look back on that now and that kind of idealistic youth he had. After school, Nick, Mick, and Phil decided to carry on with the band. The other guitarist was sent to America, according to Mick, in order to keep him away from Nick's influence, but who knows if that is true or just a part of the myth making that Nick Cave is kind of famous for. The group also added Tracy Pugh as a bassist. He joined after the former bassist moved away to study agriculture, though I did see somewhere else that the old bassist sold his bass to buy a telescope, so that's the reason he left the band. Tracy Pugh was born in 1957 and raised in a suburban town in Victoria, spending some of his childhood in New Zealand. When he was 3 years old, he watched his brother pass away from a seizure. His mom described the impact of that moment, saying, "It was the loudest sound I had ever heard. Gary had never had a seizure that we know of. Tracy saw it happen. He said to me, 'Gary just closed his eyes and fell, Mom.'" Tracy first learned how to play the clarinet, but then he met a neighbor of his who played bass in a band called the Moodist. That guy, Chris Walsh, lived around the corner and he taught Tracy how to play bass and introduced him to bands like the Stooges. By the time he got to school, Tracy was known as a class clown. Mick Harvey remembered, "I was introduced to him at roll call, and of course the teacher got to Tracy Pugh and everybody childishly laughed about his name. By the next year, he was the life of the party." His friends at school, they called themselves the Art House Gang, this like Nick, Mick, Phil, Tracy conglomerate. They didn't even know he played bass. He was kind of secretive and he kept a lot of things to himself, even though he would had a very boisterous live wire personality. He still was kind of secretive in a lot of ways. Nick said that he wasn't the person you thought he was. He was very smart, a huge reader, but also prone to misbehave. Or, as Mick very succinctly put it, a very, very smart person and a very, very naughty boy. Apparently, he acquired his first bass by liberating it from a music shop through a broken window, and he got his first amp in kind of the same way. So with the four of them, the band really got going, alternating between playing covers of songs from the punk and proto-punk scene and a few of their own songs. Australia around this time was starting to develop its own punk scene, centered on bands like Radio Birdman and The Saints, so they were adopting some of that sensibility. They were also calling themselves the Boys Next Door. Phil explained these early days of the band of the Boys Next Door playing in Melbourne as kind of this like sunny, bright, happy time. I mean, it's Australia, so the weather is generally better than it would be in like England or even New York. They're near home, so they can go get home cooked meals whenever they need it. They have that safety net of their parents and their family and their old childhood friends. They're definitely not a part of the mainstream scene, but they're in their little music community full of like minded musicians and like minded bands, all playing the same style of music and really buying into it and loving it. They're gigging regularly, they're playing all the time. It's just seemed like a pretty good time for these young people in this band. They had this belief that what they were doing was better than what they heard elsewhere. Phil said it was incredible self-belief more than anything else. They were a part of this downtown art scene in Melbourne that felt more like a community built around art and working outside of any system. They understood that they wouldn't fit into the traditional music scene, especially in Australia where they were not ready for punk music in the mainstream scene, so they just built their own scene. But the underground music scene was all about punk. So these kind of labels and indie projects that were coming up wanted to make it all about punk. So they were put on the sampler of punk bands, and the label that put out that sampler, which was called Mushroom Records, thought that the Boys Next Door had the biggest following. So they signed the Boys Next Door to a record contract. But according to Nick, he didn't think there was anything really distinct about the band at that point. They didn't have their own sound. They just kind of sounded like everyone else. But in 1978, their sound changed dramatically when Roland Howard joined the group. Nick first saw him playing in a group called the Young Charlatans, who he thought were doing something really special and unique. They were a bit more experimental than the Boys Next Door or the other punk bands in the scene, and Nick and Roland had met each other from just being in the same scene. Roland explained, "The first time I met Nick, I went to this party, and when I walked in, someone told me that somebody had just ripped a sink off the wall in the bathroom. It was Nick." He then said that Nick grabbed him by the throat, slammed him into the wall, and demanded to know if he was a punk. But the next time he saw Nick a few days later, Nick was very apologetic and invited invited him to a party, and then whenever Roland got to the party, Nick proceeded to do the same exact thing again. Roland was born in 1959 in Melbourne, and according to his younger brother, he was always different from other kids. At 10, he had long hair, wore all black, and carried a walking stick. The family was pretty musical, with his father playing recorder and his mother playing guitar and singing together. By the early 70s, inspired by people like Roxy Music and Brian Eno, Roland had started taking guitar lessons. He also became an avid reader, and in school, he learned how to play saxophone and started a couple of bands with his school friends. It was in his band, the Young Charlatans, that Roland started writing a lot of the music. He was always a little bit strange and different, but that led to him writing some pretty great songs. When the Young Charlatans imploded, the Boys Next Door understood Roland's talent and thought that he could help ignite their own songwriting, something that they weren't great at yet, so they invited him in. With Roland in the group, they were able to push things more than ever before. He brought something different that, according to Nick, widened the horizons of what the band could actually be. Also in 1978, around the same time that Roland was joining the group, Nick's father tragically passed away in a car accident. And that is kind of seen as like the catalyst for the next part of this band's journey and their story. It's something that inspired Nick to want to prove himself, to prove that he could do it and make it as a creative in this world. I think it's also the point where Nick started to create this persona for himself. He started creating myths about who he was. He created this Nick Cave the Rocker character that was a little bit separate from who he actually was. They were mixed, but a little bit separate, and that would happen a lot more after the birthday party, but I think this is kind of the origin of where that started going. And as Nick explained it, there are times when the truth is necessary and times when myth making is necessary. When you're talking about rock and roll, myth making is what it's all about. As the reputation of this band grew, they started getting more and more into drugs and alcohol, with the exception of Mick, who was generally more of a teetotaler, at least at the beginning. Apparently, and I don't know if this is true, but it's what I heard, since Australia is so close to Asia, heroin was super common and super easy to get into the country, so it became a kind of recreational drug almost. By the time he joined the Boys Next Door, Roland had already written several songs for his old band, and one of them, Shivers, was written when he was just 16, it would become a staple for the Boys Next Door. They were playing around Melbourne and finding out what their sound was and what their image was. They'd recorded an album for Mushroom Records, but then Mushroom decided to stop with punk and shelved the album. But that meant that they could go into the studio and record a new album with Roland, something that was more their new style. They played a ton of shows, and that helped them perfect their live show and become a super solid live band, while also allowing them to develop their sound and their style in their music. That new album with Roland was released by Mushroom in 1979, and it contains Shivers, which would be their most known song, but Nick kind of discounts that album. He thinks they were too young and basically trying too hard to be witty and clever. After that album, Mushroom dropped them, probably realizing that their sound was a little weirder than what Mushroom was looking for, but that gave the group the freedom to really try something new, to start a whole new chapter. Nick said that the band knew they wanted to move to England as early as 1978, but they were just so disorganized and they just couldn't put it together. But in 1980, they played their farewell show at the Seaview Ballroom in Melbourne and then left for England. And the reason that they wanted to move to London and wanted to move to England was because a lot of the bands that they loved and really respected came from England. They knew that London had a more established music scene that was more primed for the style of music they were playing and more ready for something different than the Australian mainstream was. They knew how good they were. They knew the potential of the band. So they figured if they were ever actually going to make a go of it, they kind of needed to be in a scene like London. But Nick did talk about how they had opportunities on Australia, like when they opened for the Stranglers during an Australia tour, but the band always found ways to mess it up. They would get too drunk before the gigs, and he put that down to them knowing that they would never find mainstream success in Australia. He said, "We can't help but take them fairly lightheartedly because it's obvious, particularly in Australia, that people's ears won't hear what they don't like. There's just no way you're going to be able to revolutionize an Australian audience's way of thinking about music." On some point on the plane trip to London, no one is quite sure exactly when or why or how it happened, the band changed its name. They boarded the plane as the Boys Next Door, and they got off in London as the Birthday Party. But London didn't turn out to be the dream that they expected it to be. That first year there, they only played like 11 shows, and most of their energy was spent on trying to find money for rent and food and to survive. Though Phil says that certain members of the band, like him and Mick, had better stress management, so it wasn't so bad for them. They just got jobs and used that money to pay rent and buy food, but the others weren't making the best decisions with what they chose to spend money on, so it was really tough, especially with no support system of family and community. It was particularly hard on Roland, who claims that he got malnutrition when he was there. It was when the drugs stopped being for fun and started being for escape from the situation they were in. They got a reputation as a junkie band, and that made people stay away from them in the London scene. They also became pretty disillusioned with the music scene in London. For one, they weren't making any waves, no one cared about them, but for another, they just weren't impressed. They expected these London bands to be incredible, but Phil remembered going to a Susie and the Banshee show and being really let down. They were kind of sloppy. It left them feeling like, is that it? These people aren't better than us. Is that the reason we came over here? Roland remembered it was so boring. We very quickly got over any inferiority complex we might have had about coming from Australia and realized that coming from Australia was actually a benefit. They tried finding a label, but no one wanted them, so they self-released their single Mr. Clarinet and started shopping it around. Ivo Watts Russell from a label called 4AD saw one of their shows and was really impressed, so he grabbed one of the singles and got it some airtime on the John Peel show that had a ton of listenership, and once they got airplay there, they started to pick up steam in England. Pretty soon, they were signed to 4AD, and they released their debut album called The Birthday Party in November of 1980. It was a mix of previously recorded Boys Next Door songs and a few new Birthday Party songs. Looking back at what they managed to do with their first year in London, Mick said, "I think we really expected to achieve a lot more, but I don't think we should have expected that much. In fact, I think we've achieved a lot more than we should have expected to." While on a tour in Australia, they decided to record their next album there and bring it back with them to London. By this point, it felt like they were clicking a little bit more. They really understood who they were, what they wanted to be, what they wanted to do, what they wanted their sound and aesthetic to be like. It was just all making sense. That album, Prayers on Fire, was released in April of 1981. They were getting a reputation for being a really good live band, so this album was seen as trying to capture that attitude on tape, which is a notoriously difficult thing to do. But kind of playing into that rebellious, nothing really matters persona, the band turned on the album pretty quickly. Tracy Pugh said, "Prayers on Fire stinks, quite honestly. The engineer slept through the entire session for a start, but then even Release the Bats isn't as good as it could be." Release the Bats was the B-side of a single that hit right as that gothic music, gothic rock revolution was happening, so it fit perfectly in that. And it was also a John Peel single, so it just has this cult following. It became a really big song for them. But there was also this weird splintering happening with the group. Back in Australia, they were lauded as heroes and rock stars and had a great reception there. But then they would go back to England where they were still struggling to get a foothold and going back and forth and never really establishing themselves in either of those scenes. Leaning into the gothic imagery, their next album, Junkyard, released in 1982, relied heavily on American Southern Gothic themes. It was a very conceptual album, and recording it was intense. They wanted it to sound different from what a record was supposed to sound like. By the time this album was recorded, the band was really struggling. Tracy was arrested for drunk driving, along with a litany of other things that the cops wanted to speak to him about that he had just completely ignored, so he was sentenced to some time back in Australia, which meant that he couldn't do the bass parts on the album. Phil was already contemplating leaving the group, so Mick had to play drums on a few tracks. Nick was writing more and more because, as Phil suggests, Roland's songs were just too personal, and Nick was tired of singing about Roland's girlfriend. With accelerating drug habits and alcohol abuse, things were just spinning out of control. Even Mick was now getting drunk before going on stage, which is not a good sign. They were just wrapped up in this frantic pace and frantic lifestyle of recording and playing and touring and not making a lot of money and playing in dingy clubs, and it's getting exhausting and it was wearing them out. And it seemed like they kind of saw the writing on the wall, with Nick saying, "No one has a very optimistic view of what's going to happen to the group. We don't consider ourselves becoming massive." The band's live shows started to get more and more intense and turning more and more violent. It always looked like the band was on the precipice of burning to the ground. They seemingly had created this beast that they could no longer control. Nick, out of his mind on drugs most of the time, seemed to relish these situations and egg them on. He seemed to give the audience and the fans permission that they didn't have to obey the rules and they could tap into something in a different part of their psyche, something darker and more rebellious. It was all turning pretty tense and confrontational. After Junkyard, Phil was officially fired from the group. so Mick moved to drums. At this point, the band was talking about moving out of London since they didn't have the best time in London, specifically Roland, who really hated it. But Phil didn't want to leave. He said he'd like to maintain his base in London and just travel for the band. Nick said, "No, the band's moving and you're not coming." Phil joined the Psychedelic Furs and went on tour with them for a few years before leaving when they wanted him to play alongside a drum machine. Then he moved back to Melbourne and started a band called Blue Ruin. Mick said that Phil's drumming was great, but he wasn't really fitting with them creatively anymore, and he became a scapegoat. Anytime anything was going wrong, they tried to blame it on Phil. They never really felt like they were a part of the British music scene. They had bands that they really enjoyed and were friends with, specifically bands like The Fall, but they never felt that they were actually integrated into this music scene. But then when they went to Berlin, they found a bunch of other bands that they clicked with right away. They felt more at home. They felt more like a part of that. So that made them realize maybe we should relocate the band to Berlin and make that kind of our home base. Nick said it was frenetic and anarchic and really creative. It didn't have the same prejudices in the superior way that the British had about our band. Nick was really drawn to the experimental nature of the Berlin art scene. All of the speed in the city was a massive draw too, because he was really getting into speed at this point. While in Berlin, they recorded 2 more EPs, but after that, the band finally split. The exact reason for that depends on who you ask. According to Nick, he and Roland were just writing 2 completely different styles of songs, so it didn't make sense to keep going together and keep trying to make those 2 sounds work together. But other people seem to think it was Nick's new partnership with German musician Blixa Bargeld. They think that partnership kind of froze Roland out of the group. Both Blixa and Roland were very vocal about what sound they wanted. They knew exactly what they wanted, so they didn't really get along. Either way, it seems like it was clearly a rift between Nick and Roland that caused the breakup. Mick seems to think that Roland had much bigger aspirations that he couldn't fulfill within the band. He wanted to be the primary songwriter, he wanted to be the singer and the frontman, but Mick said that the rest of them signed up because they wanted Nick as the frontman, so just didn't really make sense. And that left Roland feeling kind of ostracized and unconnected to the rest of the guys in the group. Instead of just carrying on without Roland, it made sense to start a new project. Nick had grown tired of what their audience had become. It was the same thing that happened with hardcore punk in America. As the scene got bigger, as the bands got more publicity and became more well known, the audience started to become full of people who were just wanting to be violent. There was this pressure on Nick to be energetic and perform, but that was exhausting. The birthday party was supposed to be about spontaneous reaction to a feeling and to a psychic experience. It wasn't meant to be a performance art piece. And it was just all getting too exhausting, so they wanted a clean slate. Roland also explained that at the absolute height of the band, at the pinnacle of success, they were earning about 80 pounds per week. And they were going at this relentless pace for 3 years, sleeping on floors and couches. And he said they were just kind of expected to go all out like that for the rest of their lives. And that was exhausting and was burning him out, and it just didn't make sense to him to keep going like that. Of course, Nick Cave went on to form the Bad Seeds with Mick and Blixa. After briefly playing with them, Tracy returned to Melbourne where he studied literature and philosophy. He toured with a reformed version of the Saints, playing on a couple of Bad Seeds albums, and worked with Lydia Lunch on a project. He had been suffering from epileptic seizures, made worse from his heavy drug use. In 1986, he suffered a fit in his bath that resulted in head trauma. He died from his brain injuries a few days later at the age of 28. Roland, who everyone agrees was an absolute genius and a completely unique guitar player, never found the success that he might have been expected to have post-birthday party. He played in a few different projects before forming These Immortal Souls with his girlfriend. He did reunite with Nick to perform backing vocals on a Bad Seeds album in 1994. In 2003, he started experiencing severe health complications, with doctors saying his liver resembled that of a 74-year-old extreme alcoholic. He died of liver disease in 2009 at 50 years of age. Mick played with the Bad Seeds for a while. Bad Seeds, of course, insanely popular. That's a whole different story. Nick Cave's post-birthday party career was massive, but Mick has since gone on to do his own pretty celebrated solo work as well. That's the story of the birthday party. They were a band that truly did something unique, but just couldn't stop themselves from burning it all down. The beast got too much, ran out of control. So let me know what you think. Let me know what you think about the birthday party. Use the comment sections below. Let me know anything I missed out on, and like the video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you want to see more of me trying to learn as much as I can about music history. And again, special thanks to all of our members. It means a lot that you want to partner with me and want to be a part of this channel and what I'm doing here. So it's really appreciated. Thank you so much.